money is the root of all evil. It turned us from gangbangers into full-fledged animals.
Detroit has, by far, the highest murder rate in the nation. About 2 murders a day.
In the 1990s, neighborhoods in Detroit were terrorized by a gang of robbers. Impersonating police officers, they invaded over 100 homes, robbing, raping, and torturing their victims.
A mother and her 15-year-old daughter were raped simultaneously by 2 members of the home invasion group.
Say their names, say Chambers are looking for you, hey, they gone, they running, they be scared, you know. They will kill you in a minute with no hesitation.
You've seen the films. You've heard the stories about New York City's crime kings like Nino Brown. But what if I told you New Jack City barely scratched the surface? And Detroit's version of the game, darker, bloodier, and far more dangerous, made Nino look soft.
Hey, she can't shoot me. Hurry up!
50 home invasion robberies from the beginning of '94 up through June of '94. They were fairly violent. They involved shootings, assaults.
New York gave you rooftop drug deals, designer coats, and champagne bottles. But Detroit had 10 Nino Browns, and none of them needed a script. They had real body counts.
In many places, the crack trade has transformed small-time hoodlums into big-time entrepreneurs. Among the most remarkable examples is the notorious Chambers Brothers gang of Detroit.
They poured gasoline on enemies, dumped bodies in abandoned houses, and arred mothers and daughters in the same room. This wasn't a movie. This was the real murder capital of America. And while Hollywood gave you the Cash Money Brothers, Detroit gave you something else entirely, a battlefield.
That since January, 37 children have been shot dead, and reaction was, oh, it all depends where you live. Well, in Detroit, they don't imagine those horrors, they live them. Many Americans find the problems of the inner city to be too overwhelming, too much to comprehend.
Before the Best Friends gang turned murder into a business model, and before Young Boys Inc. began recruiting middle schoolers, there were the Chamber Brothers. BJ, Willie, Otis, and Larry Chamber weren't born into crime. They were raised in a small Mississippi town and moved north to Detroit looking for opportunity. What they found was a crumbling city hit hard by factory shutdowns, job losses, and the rise of crack coke. By the mid-1980s, the Chamber Brothers had seized that chaos and transformed it into one of the most powerful and violent drug empires Detroit had ever seen.
The crack trade has transformed small-time hoodlums into big-time entrepreneurs. Among the most remarkable examples is the notorious Chambers Brothers gang of Detroit.
They didn't run their operation like street dealers. They ran it like a corporation. They gave to the poor.
Funds away, man, since we got $500,000.
Well, I tell you what we can do. We can give it to the poor.
That's exactly what I say too. We'll just donate those to the poor.
With over 30 drug houses under their control, the Chambers built a network that reportedly generated over $250,000 a day. Their operation included lookouts equipped with walkie-talkies, stash house managers, enforcers, and a chain of command that rivaled major businesses.
We had got to a point where we was making at least $250,000 per day, every day.
Damn.
Every day.
The Chambers drug organization was the most structured and most violent the city had ever seen. But structure wasn't the only thing that made them dangerous. Their reputation for violence was unmatched. Those who stole, lied, or even disrespected the hierarchy often vanished without a trace. Stories of torture chambers, basement beatings, and execution-style hits weren't urban legends. They were warnings. The Chamber Brothers believed in discipline and fear. They didn't issue threats. They made examples. They weren't just rich, they were visible. They drove custom cars, wore silk suits, and appeared ringside at boxing matches. In Detroit, they carried the swagger of royalty, backed by an army of loyal street soldiers.
Fast money, they seen the Chambers come down, these fancy cars, and they wanted part of the action.
To many, the 1991 film New Jack City portrayed the ultimate drug lord, Nino Brown. But Nino was fiction. The Chamber Brothers were worse.
U.S. Attorney Hayes believes that the people who now control the crack business are so unpredictably violent They even scare the old-time gangsters.
While Nino ran a club, the Chambers ran a network so sophisticated the federal government had to coordinate a series of raids just to shut them down. When federal agents finally moved in, they uncovered cash, weapons, narcotics, and documentation that proved this wasn't a small-time operation. It was a criminal empire. By 1988, the FBI could no longer ignore the scope of the Chambers' influence. Their takedown marked one of the most extensive drug busts in Detroit's history.
In their battle against the drug gangs, authorities are using new federal racketeering laws, like the one against operating a continuing criminal enterprise. That's how they got the Chambers brothers, who now face possible life terms in prison.
And yet, some say the brothers got off easy compared to the chaos they unleashed. Still, as feared as the Chamber brothers were, they followed rules. They had a code. They built an empire based on control. But in the shadows of their kingdom, another group was rising, one that didn't care about strategy, structure, or legacy. They weren't businessmen, they were. In the late 1980s, one name kept resurfacing in newspapers, federal briefings, and late-night news broadcasts, not for sports, not for Motown, but for
There's son after son and daughter after daughter. And where does it end?
By 1987, Detroit had officially earned a grim title, the murder capital of America. With over 600 homicides in a single year and a rate nearly triple the national average, the city wasn't just dangerous, it was under siege. This wasn't a random crime. It was calculated, organized, and often tied directly to the drug trade. The crack epidemic didn't just hit Detroit, it devoured it. As the auto industry crumbled and unemployment soared, entire neighborhoods were abandoned. Factories shut down, jobs disappeared, and in their place, a new economy took hold. Crack coke.
You know, mama get laid off, your house going to foreclosure, your sister need this, or your little brother need diapers, and you're like, what can I do? I can't sell drugs. They say don't sell drugs, but what can I do? I'm gonna try to go get a job. They don't hire black people.
Whole blocks transformed into open-air drug markets. Abandoned homes became trap houses. Vacant lots became war zones. And for those left behind, crack was more than just an escape. It was survival. You either sold it, smoked it, or stayed out of the way.
This house on Detroit's east side was recently busted by the feds.
The man they arrested is facing several charges of drugs and guns.
The city's homicide rate continues to climb as drug-related violence plagues the east and west sides. Gangs battled for dominance, but this wasn't about turf. It was about control. One wrong word, one missed payment, one accidental glance, and you could end up face down in an alley. Police were overwhelmed. Many stopped responding to calls in known drug zones. Some were underpaid and outgunned. Others were corrupt, accepting bribes to turn a blind eye. It wasn't uncommon to hear that a known had walked free due to lack of evidence or missing witnesses. This was a new kind of criminal, young, hungry, and fearless. Teenagers with Glocks, high school dropouts with AKs, kids who treated murder like initiation.
Town for nearly a decade.
Whether it's drugs, murder, public corruption, it's all there.
The drug game was out of control. It was like millions and millions of dollars being made through the city of Detroit at that time.
And unlike the mob bosses of the 60s or the heroin syndicates of the 70s, these weren't men in suits. They were in Kangol's and Adidas tracksuits, running street armies before they could legally drink. Many of them didn't expect to see 25 and lived like it. Even the major drug lords began to hire private bodyguards and bulletproof their vehicles. Some modified their homes with surveillance systems and steel doors. In response, enemies brought heavier weapons, Mac 10S, Tech 9S, and even grenades. What started as turf wars turned into full-blown urban combat. Detroit was no longer just a city, it was a combat zone. And in the middle of this chaos, a new gang emerged. One that didn't sell drugs for empire building, but killed for profit. They weren't businessmen like the Chamber brothers. They didn't have rules or structure. They were the best friends gang, and they would soon become the most feared killers Detroit had ever known.
Has by far the highest rate in the nation, about 2 a day.
In the heart of the murder capital, even criminals were scared of something. Not the police, not prison. They were scared of a name whispered on the east side like a curse. Best friends. It sounded innocent, almost harmless. But on Detroit's streets, the Best Friends gang represented something far more terrifying than turf or drugs. They were murderers for hire. While other gangs sold crack and beefed over corners, the best friends sold fear. They didn't just pull triggers in retaliation, they killed on contract. If you had the money, they had the muscle. No conscience, no questions. This was the dark evolution of Detroit's street game. The Chamber Brothers operated like businessmen. Young Boys Inc. were flashy dope boys, but the best friends? They were executioners. Their roster included names like Reggie Rock Brown, Darnell Supa Crutchfield, and Terry Flannery in his early days, men whose reputations were built on blood. Rumors said some of them had over 30 confirmed before turning 25. They weren't concerned with building empires. They were building body counts. Detroit police began finding patterns. Victims who had nothing to do with drug wars were shot multiple times in the head, execution style. Dealers would survive turf battles, only to get hit in front of their kids a week later. These weren't random acts, they were planned hits. And the more the best friends succeeded, the bolder they got. They filmed themselves throwing parties with stacks of cash and gold chains. They posed in photos flashing gang signs while surrounded by champagne, cars, and weapons. Their lifestyle was flashy, but their code was brutal. Anybody could be a target. It wasn't just enemies that had to worry. Even clients weren't safe. If you hired the best friends and didn't pay on time, or tried to double-cross them, you joined their list of casualties. Their most feared method? The double-tap execution. A shot to the body to drop you, and a second to the head to make sure you stayed down. No witnesses, no survivors. Their reign of terror reached a level that shook even the FBI. By 1990, they were linked to dozens of murders, from rivals and drug lords to innocent bystanders caught in the crossfire. At one point, police discovered a hit list scribbled on a napkin, with 5 names crossed out and 7 more listed below.
Best Friends gang existed for roughly 5 years and killed over 100 people. Those aren't gangsters, those are serial killers, those are sociopaths.
And while many members eventually met their fate, either in prison or in coffins, the legacy they left behind was haunting.
Be listening.
Every group ends the same way. And that was the end of the Best Friends.
Because unlike the other Detroit gangs who built criminal empires, the Best Friends gang specialized in one thing: ending them.
Friends gang were the most bloodthirsty crime syndicate the city of Detroit had seen since Prohibition.
Every empire falls. The Romans, the cartels, the Chambers, even the Best Friends gang. By the early 1990s, Detroit's streets had seen it all. Millions in drug money had passed through the hands of teenagers. Bodies had dropped in every zip code. Police scanners buzzed with new murders by the hour. But slowly, something began to change. The drug trade didn't disappear, it burned out. What once felt like invincibility started to feel like a curse. With every new dollar came more paranoia. With every flashy car came more surveillance. And with every murder, feds inched closer. And that heat hit hard. Federal agents launched Operation Crackdown, a coordinated series of raids targeting the biggest names in Detroit's drug underworld. Grand juries were called. Wiretaps recorded every whispered threat, every boastful confession. Informants flipped. Mothers testified. Childhood friends traded loyalty for lighter sentences. One by one, the kings of the street were dragged into courtrooms, no longer untouchable. Prosecutors came prepared. RICO charges, money laundering, weapons trafficking, conspiracy to commit murder. The Chambers were hit. Young Boys Inc. crumbled. Best Friends members vanished, either into the prison system or into early graves. And the neighborhoods they once ruled, ghost towns. The drug houses were either raided or abandoned. The flashy cars were gone. The music stopped. The blood-soaked empire had collapsed under its own weight. But this wasn't a fairy tale ending. The damage had already been done. Detroit's murder rate may have dipped slightly, but the trauma lingered. Generations of children had grown up watching murders from their windows. Entire families were lost, some to bullets, others to addiction. Schools shut down. Jobs never returned. And the city's image was forever stained. What made it worse was how easily it could have been avoided. A lack of opportunity, systemic neglect, and federal policies that punished addiction instead of treating it all created a pressure cooker. The city's youth weren't born killers, they were cornered into it. And when the blood money dried up, so did the illusion of power. The end wasn't cinematic. There were no grand final shootouts, no Scarface moments, just courtrooms, handcuffs, and silence. Some tried to flip their street fame into rap careers or business ventures. A few survived. Most didn't. Detroit, once a symbol of American industry, had become a cautionary tale of what happens when a city is abandoned and when its streets are left to rule themselves.
20 years ago, you couldn't come into this restaurant. You had to wait in line for about 45 minutes. to get a table. Right now, look, it's empty. On the regular, on a Sunday.
But even in the ashes, something new was growing. A city ready to rebuild, a new generation ready to write a different story. Because Detroit's past was soaked in blood, but its future, still unwritten. The streets bled, the courts slammed the door shut, the empires collapsed, but the story didn't die. It transformed. As the dust settled on Detroit's most violent decade, a new generation rose, not with dope in their hands, but with microphones. They weren't just rapping for fun. They were documenting, preserving history, turning the names of drug lords and gang leaders into street folklore, and just like that, the very same people who once haunted the nightly news became mythological icons in the booth.
Jerry Production.
From neighborhood mixtapes to national stages, Detroit's hip-hop scene started name-dropping the very legends who had once ruled the blocks. Rappers like Blade Icewood, Street Lord Juan, and Big Herc referenced the Chamber Brothers, Young Boys Inc., and Best Friends Gang. Not out of worship, but to stake their own credibility. These names carried weight. They were like Detroit's own mafia lore. But it wasn't just about respect. It was about trauma, too. These artists had grown up hearing gunshots as lullabies. They had cousins locked up forever, friends gunned down in broad daylight. Their verses weren't fantasy. They were survival, a warning, a mirror. Rap gave Detroit's youth a voice when no one else listened. The government had ignored them. Schools had failed them. But music, that was theirs. They told the truth, no matter how ugly it sounded. And in telling that truth, they kept the memory of the city's darkest era alive. Some even blurred the lines between street and studio. Take the rise of BMF, Black Mafia Family, founded by Detroit natives Demetrius Big Meech and Terry Southwest T. Flannery. BMF wasn't just a drug empire. It was also a music brand. They invested in artists, threw flashy parties, and rubbed shoulders with stars like Jeezy and Fabulous. But behind the platinum chains and Maybachs, the legacy of Detroit's street code remained. Detroit's rap scene never forgot the streets that made it. Even Eminem, the city's most famous export, painted grim pictures of growing up in the shadows of violence and poverty. His 8 Mile narrative was just one piece of a much bigger puzzle. Others, like T Grizzly, Payroll Giovanni, PZ, and Icewear Vezo, continued the tradition, balancing the pain of the past with the pride of survival. Their lyrics became both tributes and testimonies. They weren't just making music. They were archiving pain, documenting the ruins, shining light on the names forgotten by time but remembered on every corner. From faded murals to viral rap bars, Detroit's darkest era lived on. Not in textbooks, not in movies, but in the voices of those who lived it. Because long after the drugs dried up and the bullets stopped flying, the music kept the memories alive. In 1991, New Jack City hit theaters and shocked the world. Wesley Snipes, iced out and cold-blooded, brought Nino Brown to life, a ruthless kingpin who ran a crack empire out of a Harlem high-rise. The audience were hooked. The movie was bold, stylish, and raw. But if you were from Detroit, you knew better. You knew that Nino Brown, as dangerous as he was on screen, didn't even come close to the monsters that roamed your block. Let's break it down. Nino Brown ran his operation from one apartment complex. The Chamber Brothers ran an empire stretching across multiple states, moving hundreds of kilos per month, backed by military-grade weapons and a small army of teenage foot soldiers. The Carter Building in New Jack City had surveillance cameras and hired muscle. The Chambers turned entire neighborhoods into strongholds. They had secret compartments in houses, cash laundering setups in car washes, and connections that ran from local cops all the way to Atlanta and Mississippi. And unlike Nino Brown's cartoonish arrogance, the Detroit players didn't care for the spotlight. They operated in the shadows, quiet, deadly, and always watching. Even Young Boys Inc., another infamous Detroit crew, made Nino Brown's empire look small. YBI mastered corporate-level branding, using beepers, pay stubs, and clean-cut image management to keep their young dealers looking like students instead of gangsters. They employed lawyers, laundered money through car dealerships, and moved so quietly that even when people were dying, the city couldn't keep up. Hollywood gave Nino Brown a flashy backstory, a few brutal scenes, and a redemption arc. Detroit's real didn't have writers, they didn't have morals, and they damn sure didn't leave survivors. The Best Friends gang alone would have made Nino run for cover. These weren't drug dealers dabbling in violence. These were by trade, men who were paid to end lives and disappear. No speeches, no slow-motion gun battles, just precision executions in silence. Even the flashy fashion in New Jack City paled in comparison. Detroit's street kings were dripping in gator shoes, Rolex watches, and custom-made Dapper Dan suits. But behind the glam was real dirt. Bodies in trunks, corrupt funeral homes, friends turning on friends before they turned up dead. And yet, Hollywood never touched it. No Detroit drug movie, no Chamber Brothers biopic, no cinematic retelling of the best friend's death list. Why? Because it wasn't just too real, it was too disturbing, too close to home, too far beyond what audiences were ready to accept. New Jack City was entertainment, but Detroit, that was war. And while Nino Brown became a pop culture icon, the real legends of Detroit were buried, locked up, or forgotten. No closing credits, no epic soundtrack, just chalk outlines and silence.
The city had seen gangsters, they'd seen mobsters, they'd seen kingpins, but they never saw the level of complete devotion to and litter the street with bodies as they saw with the best friends.
When the last gunshot echoed, when the sirens faded, when the feds locked the final cell door, Detroit didn't celebrate, it mourned. Because behind every drug empire that fell, behind every headline about kingpins and gangs, was a city bleeding in silence. The streets weren't just battlegrounds, they were neighborhoods. Places where grandmothers sat on porches, where kids once played freeze tag, where soul food spots used to be packed every Friday night, and when the drug wars hit, all of that disappeared.
At the same time, you have a landscape that's dotted with abandoned homes. The city proper was falling apart.
What Detroit really lost was its future. So many young men, full of potential, were swallowed by the game. Smart kids who could have been engineers, doctors, teachers, became soldiers in a war they didn't even start. Others never got the chance. Bullets robbed them before they turned 18. Families were ripped apart. Mothers buried sons. Daughters grew up fatherless. Schools closed. Businesses vanished. And trust in government, in police, in each other disintegrated like the factories that once gave the city its pride. Even the people who made it out carried the scars. Some turned to music, others turned to prison ministry, activism, or silence. But almost everyone in Detroit has a story. A cousin, a brother, a neighbor, someone who never made it home. But Detroit didn't die. It adapted. It rebuilt. Not all at once, and not without pain. But the soul of Detroit refused to fade. New artists rose up, not to glorify the past, but to speak for it. Programs started forming, grassroots, underfunded, but real. Men who once ran corners now mentor kids on avoiding the same mistakes. Women who lost children now stand at podiums demanding change. And now, Detroit tells a new story, one not written in crack vials and chalk outlines, but in resilience, rebirth, and the refusal to be forgotten.
There was dozens and dozens and dozens of homicides brought up. One of the lawyers described it to me that there were so many murders they couldn't remember, you know, did I kill that guy on Thursday and we killed this other guy on Friday?
Detroit didn't need Hollywood. The real story was always darker and far more dangerous. See you soon for the next story.